All right, so I'm going to start teaching. Everybody, we're starting a new book. We're starting the book of Samuel. And it's very exciting because Samuel is actually probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite book in this section of the Bible, in the prophets, what we call the prophets. And I don't know if you're aware, but the way the Jewish Bible is organized, it's mostly the same, but there are some differences in between the way I'm talking about the Hebrew scriptures, the way they're organized for us and the way they're organized for you. So I went from Judges straight to Samuel, and I believe in your Bible you have the book of Ruth in between. And so this is a difference in how our books are organized. Or for us, Ruth is at the last section of the Bible called the writings, which is a different status than the prophets, which is where we are now. So in the Hebrew scriptures, Samuel comes right after the book of Judges. Now, in many ways, and we talked about this, in many ways, the Judges kind of leads up into the book of Samuel. If we think about clearly the main figure at the beginning of the book of Samuel is Samuel himself. But as the book continues, really what's unique about the book of Samuel, it is the crowning of two kings. He initially crowns Saul. Saul doesn't work out for a number of reasons. And then he crowns David. And the rest of the book of Samuel, to the very end, is really about David. In fact, midway through the book, Samuel dies. Okay, so it is called the book of Samuel, but I would say that what unifies all of the book is the fact that we are talking about three leaders in this book. Samuel, from Samuel, we have Saul, who he crowned, and afterwards we have David, who he crowned, and that really unifies the book. So in a way, Samuel is about the beginning of the kings and a complete change in the way the people of Israel were ruled, because we started with Joshua, and we have one leader who's a national leader. And basically, he's more of a general than a leader. His role is to lead the children of Israel in war, to capture the land, to make it their own. And he's also directing the allocation of the land to the various tribes and their settlement. But we know that when Joshua dies, the job is not completed. When the book of Judges opens, we don't have a single leader. We know from the beginning that one of the things that they're challenged by and also trying to finish is to complete the allocation of the land. The actual boundaries have been set, but the tribes have not all succeeded in taking possession of all their land. And that creates a lot of problems. And for each of these problems, for each of the various enemies that gain traction throughout the book of Judges, there's a different, very local leader that comes up. Usually a leader from a particular tribe may coordinate a battle with an enemy, maybe bringing a few tribes together. But one of the things that characterizes the Judges is that there is no one national leader. At the very end of the book, we have those two horrible stories that we discussed, and it is clear in three different times the scripture tells us that in those days there was no king of Israel. So we have a sense that the fact that there is no one king, there is no national leader to unify the entire nation, to lead it through whatever challenges it might have, that is creating some of the extreme chaos and sin that we see represented in those last two stories. So when we open up the book of Samuel, and as we said, the main thrust of the book of Samuel is creating or bringing in this different kind of government, a king, ultimately ushering in the kingdom of David, the house of David, which, as we know, will be the eternal kingdom or king family or royal family or whatever of the nation of Israel. So this has really been one transition from the failure of this tribal, decentralized kind of government that we see in Judges coming into Samuel, in which we will see ushered in a whole new type of government and leadership, both spiritual and political. So that's just kind of an overview of what Samuel is all about. One of the things that's very interesting is the beginning of the book tells quite a detailed story about the circumstances of the birth of Samuel, which is unusual. We don't have too many leadership figures that we have such a detailed story about the circumstances of their birth. In many ways, it reminds me of the story of Moses, because Moses, like Samuel, there's a difficulty in the very conception, in a way, the very fact of his birth. If you recall, when it comes to Moses, we learn about a family, in this case, one husband, one wife, Amram, but they are living in a time of a terrible decree. So we don't have an issue of fertility, but we have an issue of this decree where Pharaoh is throwing all the boys born into the Nile, killing all the boys. So there's a certain hesitancy about having a baby. And then when Moses is born, there's tremendous tension as to whether he will survive, and he's hidden for 3 months. And the whole time you read this story, if you don't know what happens next, you relate to it as a very nice story, a story of a family, and they have a baby, and the question of whether the baby will survive. And there's a very nice happy ending. The baby survives, and we have the Pharaoh's wife, and she is the one who ends up raising him. And he for the first few years until he is weaned from his mother, he is with his birth mother. But then when he's, I assume, something like 3 years old, he then goes to the daughter of Pharaoh, who ends up raising him, and she does. And then we have the story of how he is as a young man. And only many, many years later, when he's actually 80 years old, does he step into this very unique role that God has for him, appointing him a leader of Israel. So it's really, initially, as we read the story, it's a very nice story. And only at the end of the story do we realize, hey, wait a second, this is a very important man, this Moses. And then you may ask yourself, why do we need to know the story of his birth? Okay, and there's different reasons, and we're not really going to study Exodus right now. But I think when we read Samuel, you can't avoid the comparison. Samuel is born from a mother who is having fertility issues. She is a beloved wife of Elkanah, and there's another wife there too. And yet the other wife is having loads of children, so we know that Elkanah doesn't have a problem, but she herself is having terrible issues, and of course she prays. And it is in many ways similar to the miracle that Moses is somehow rescued. That Miriam puts Moses in that little basket and putting him in the Nile, having no idea what will happen to him. And it is truly a miracle that the daughter of Pharaoh comes along and, rescues him. In a very similar way, there is this miracle as a result of her prayer, of Hannah's prayer, that she is pregnant and she ends up giving birth to Samuel. Now, you will recall that, as I mentioned, Moses is raised by a birth mother just for a few years, and then he's handed over to the daughter of Pharaoh. And you may say that the daughter of Pharaoh serves a very important role here, because knowing what happens to Moses afterwards, he is the person who has to, as a leader of a nation of slaves, has to be bold enough to go before the king, before Pharaoh, and demand that he release the nation of Israel. So the very fact that he grew up in the palace clearly gives him tools, confidence, that he would need in order to be able to confront Pharaoh, which I'm assuming would be very hard for him to do had he grown up as an ordinary slave in the house of Amram. Similarly here, Samuel is raised by his birth mother for the first few years, but as we'll recall, and we'll read this inside, she made a vow when she prayed to God, asking for a child. She made a vow that if she did conceive a child, she would bring him back to the tabernacle where he would be raised. And so very similar to Moses, Samuel was only raised by his birth mother for the first few years of his life. Once she has weaned him and he's a bit older, she brings him to the tabernacle where he is essentially raised by Eli, the high priest. And again, like Moses, this is perhaps an ideal upbringing for Samuel to prepare him for what will be his role leading the nation of Israel as a prophet, as a spiritual leader, not as much a political leader. To have grown up in the tabernacle as a servant of God, and to be encouraged by Eli as he receives his first prophecy, this, of course, is going to serve him in his later role very well. So I think you see very much these comparisons, and I think it's not by coincidence. I think as we read these stories, the Bible is trying to tell us, when you see Samuel, think Moses. Now, actually, in the book of Psalms, if you go to Psalms chapter 99, it begins, "The Lord enthroned on cherubim is king." It's a beautiful, beautiful psalm of exaltation and praise to God. But it also tells us a little bit about God and about the people who worshiped him. And if you see in verse 6, it says as follows: "Moses and Aaron among his priests, Samuel among those who call on his name. When they called to the Lord, he answered them. He spoke to them in a pillar of cloud. They obeyed his decrees, the law he gave them. O Lord your God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God for them, but you exacted retribution for their misdeeds." So what this psalmist now is saying is he's making a comparison between Moses and Aaron on the one hand and Samuel on the other. There's a lot of commentaries who talk about this, but clearly Samuel is being compared to Moses, not only to Moses, but also to Aaron. We see clearly it says he spoke to them in a pillar of cloud. And here, really, God didn't speak to Aaron through a pillar of cloud. He much more spoke to Moses. And this is the idea of Moses as a prophet, which, of course, is Samuel's main characteristic. He's a prophet. God will speak to him. In a pillar of cloud, I think in this case, we think of actually something that we just read recently in our Torah portions at the very end of the book of Exodus, when the tabernacle, in fact, we just read this verse this past Saturday, two days ago, or 2 days ago, the very, very end of the book of Exodus, we have the following Exodus chapter 40, verse 34. "The cloud covered the tent of meeting." The tabernacle, the tent of meeting, has all just been erected and completed. And we learn here, "The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle." So we have here this image of the cloud covering the tabernacle. And we know, both from verses before and verses afterwards, that God actually speaks to Moses from above the Ark of the Covenant, which is sitting in the tent of meeting. So there is this cloud. I think when Psalms is talking about speak to them in a pillar of cloud, he's talking about speaking to them from the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, as that cloud rests on the tabernacle, which we learn about at the end of Exodus. And I think this very much connects us to Samuel as well, because Samuel himself begins his prophecies. He first encounters God in the tabernacle itself. He is there serving God in the tabernacle. Now, it's kind of interesting because he is not a Levite, okay? And yet he clearly has some sort of role in the tabernacle. He's not a priest. He's not a Levite. From this verse at the very beginning of Samuel, we learn that he's actually from the tribe of Ephraim, but he serves a very interesting role in the tabernacle. But clearly, God does speak to him from the tabernacle, from that same idea of a cloud. And so I think here this is another way that we see a comparison between the two. Both of them clearly are considered to be leaders of the nation, having received the word from God and communicating that word to the nation and from the nation back to God. So just all of these things together, I think, are something very important in understanding Samuel. Already from the beginning, we have a sense that who this Samuel may well be, based upon some of the hints and connections with the story of Moses. Now, there's other few stories that I would say we are reminded of when we read the story of Samuel. One is Samson, because Samson too, there is a story about his birth. Okay, the difference is we learn much less about his actual birth and childhood, which we do with Moses and with Samuel. We learn much more from Samson. Is really just about a prophecy. Okay, the big story in Samson is the fact that an angel appears to Samson's parents and tells them about the circumstance of birth, telling them that they will have a child. But one of the things that's, aside from there is a story of the birth that's very common between the two of them, is that in both of them we have this idea of not cutting their hair. We know that Samson is considered a Nazirite, and one of the instructions that the angel gives to the parents is that they cannot cut his hair. But we also see that in the story of Samuel, that he is not going to have his hair cut. Let's see, where do I just saw it. I'm just trying to see where. I'll give you the exact verse of that. Anyway, I don't know. It's here somewhere. We'll read it. Okay. Anyway, so that is another comparison. And finally, the whole story of Samuel's family situation reminds us of actually a great whatever grandparents of Samuel himself. We learn that Elkanah is of the tribe of Ephraim, and Ephraim, of course, is the son of Joseph, who is the son of Rachel. And very similar to the story of Jacob and then Rachel and Leah, we see the story of Elkanah and his two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah has many children, but it is Hannah that he really loves, and she is the one who is barren. And it's very, very similar to the story of Jacob, who has this wife, Rachel, and who doesn't have children, takes her a long time to have children, and it's very distressing for her, and she's very jealous of Leah, and Leah, who is the least loved wife, but yet has many children. And when you read here in verse 2, when it says he has two wives, one named Hannah and the other Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. I think the assumption there is that Hannah is the first wife. The first wife is always the wife of love, the one that the man sees first and wants and loves. And it's very possible that the only reason he married Peninnah was because Hannah was not having children. And he really wanted to have children, Elkanah, and so he took a second wife to produce children. And that, of course, is always a recipe for disaster. Very similar thing happened with, of course, Sarah, who suggested Abraham takes Hagar so that she will have children. That did not work out so well. And even with the story of Jacob and Leah and Rachel, at one point it is Rachel who suggests, why don't you take my maid and have children through her? And then Leah does the same. Whatever it is, it's not a good situation when you have two wives, and one is, on the one hand, the more beloved of the husband, and the other one is the one who's having children. It is not a good situation. But unlike the story of Jacob and Rachel, where we learn a great deal about the inner resentments of the family as they move forward in life, of course, culminating in the sale of Joseph, in the case of Hannah and Peninnah, it seems that all of that tension comes to an end as soon as Hannah has her child. Anyway, that's just some insights that I wanted to bring forward now before we actually go in to the story. But let's just start reading and see where we come from. Okay, there was a man from Ramathaim of the Tzuphites in the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Yeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Tzuf, an Ephraimite. So we have his whole lineage, and as I said, we know he's an Ephraimite. He actually lives in the Mount of Ephraim. There is a Jewish community today called Elkanah. It is in between, more or less midway between Tel Aviv and maybe Ariel, or Tel Aviv and the Jordan Valley even. It's like along that road in the middle of the country. And it's called Elkanah because it is assumed that that location is very close to it. It's in the mountain of Ephraim, and it's very close to what would probably have been then Ramatayim Tzufim. But exactly where that is, we're not 100% sure. Okay, he had two wives, one named Hannah, the other Penina. Penina had children, but Hannah was childless. This man used to go up from his town every year to worship and to offer sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh. Hophni and Pinchas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord there. So first of all, if you recall, at the end of the book of Judges, we learned the story of the idol of Micah and the temple that ended up being built. And one of the things that we learned there is that this is in Judges chapter 18, the very last verse of chapter 18, verse 31. They maintained the idol that Micah had made throughout the time that the house of God stood at Shiloh. And what we talked about then was that actually already then, and as we discussed when that exactly happened, it's very possible that those stories at the end of the book of the Judges actually took place towards the beginning of the period itself. So based on that, we have these two rival tabernacles, or temples actually, at the same time, the tabernacle of Shiloh and this rival pagan temple of Micah that are both going at the same time. Now, Jewish sources, our traditions, are telling us that unfortunately, for a good part of the time of the tabernacle at Shiloh, it became a very unpopular place. I mean, we know from the Bible, from the book of Deuteronomy, God says very specifically that he expects all males, at the very least, to come up to the tabernacle or to the temple 3 times a year for the pilgrimage festivals, and that is the expectation. But it seems that at that time, there were very few people who were actually doing it. So when we hear that this man used to go up from his town every year to worship and to offer sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, we can already hear in the way the story is being told that it was a unique thing. This man went up, every year to offer his sacrifices. He did it, but most people did not. And in fact, one of the traditions that we have is that if you picture, if you have a better kind of an understanding of how the map of Israel looks today, but if you have him sitting in where, let's say, Elkanah would be today, which is at the western edge of Mount Ephraim, and if he goes due east and just a bit south, he will hit Shiloh. Okay, so the legend is that as he would walk east, he would be stopping along the way in all these little Jewish villages, and he would say to the people there, come, we're going to the tabernacle. Why don't you join us? So he clearly was a man that was very attached to the temple and was not willing to give this up. But we learn right away that there are two sons of Eli, who were priests there. Now, this is also very interesting. We will learn later on that it is Eli who is the priest. He's actually the high priest. He's the guy running the place. And yet, before we meet Eli, we meet his two sons. And that, of course, is something we're also going to learn about further on. Who are these guys? And we will learn that they're very, very problematic people. They are corrupt. They are using the tabernacle as a place of corruption, of moral corruption and financial corruption. And they're really turning the place on its head. Instead of being a holy place, it is a place where these two awful people are taking advantage of women and taking advantage of people who are coming there to pray out of desperation for whatever they need. And so in a way, I think it's contrasting. You have Elkanah on the one hand, who's this man who doesn't give up, even though the tabernacle has been taken over by these no good fellows in many ways, and yet he is not going to give in to that, and he's going to continue coming to Shiloh every year. So this already tells us something about who is this family, Samuel's family. His father is a devoted man to the tabernacle, to the service of God, and he's not going to let these corrupt individuals get in his way. Okay, and then we came to verse 4. On a particular day, Elkanah offered a sacrifice. He used to give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he would give. Now here, the question is how this is translated. The word in Hebrew is mana achat apayim, one portion, and then this word apayim. And the commentators are all trying to figure out, what does that mean, apayim? One thing that you know about the word apayim is that it's double. When you ever use that aim kind of structure, whatever the singular is, it's double. The word af, okay, usually means nose, okay. It's also an expression for a face, and it can also be expression for anger. In the Bible, when they talk about God's anger, they'll talk about haron af, literally the anger of his nose or the anger of his face, okay. So here we have this word, and on the one hand it means double, and on the other hand it might be anger or face. And indeed we have commentaries that describe this 3 different ways. One, that it was a particularly nice portion, taking the word face. In other words, it would, when presented to someone's face, it would gladden their face in a very unique way, a double way, a special way. Another commentary said it just means double. He gave Hannah twice the amount that he gave everybody else in the family. And finally, the idea is that this is against the anger. It's like an antidote. Hannah is anger. She's upset. She, at her situation. And so he gives her this portion in a special way, or maybe the contents are special, in order to help alleviate her frustration and her anger. Whatever it is, we have, the end of that sentence, because though Hannah was his favorite, but the Lord had closed her womb. So we have a sense here that on the one hand, Hannah is clearly his favorite. He loves her more. He pays special attention to giving her his portion because God has closed her womb. And that puts her in a very difficult situation. And then in verse 6, we learn about her rival. Now, the Hebrew word for rival is Sarah. Here it says Sarata, her Sarah. And I love this word, Sarah. This is a word that is, the source of it is here in the book of Samuel, but is also a word that's used later on in Hebrew as well. Sarah literally means trouble. And it is the word used for a rival wife, not rival anything else, just a rival wife. You're the second wife, the rival wife within the family is used the word trouble. And it's a way that the Bible is telling us, yes, you're allowed to have multiple wives, but learn, they are trouble. You are bringing trouble into your household if you have more than one wife. So I would say that is definitely true. And we see this in so many of the stories where they have multiple wives, but certainly in this one as well. And so we learn here that moreover, her rival, to make her miserable, would taunt her that the Lord had closed her womb. So this was, again, the kind of rivalry we saw with Rachel and Leah as well. This happened year after year. Every time she went up to the house of the Lord, the other, or her rival, would taunt her so that she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why are you crying? Why aren't you eating? Why are you so sad? Am I not more devoted to you than 10 sons? And I think with this, and this is where we'll end today, and we'll pick up next week. I think with this statement, Elkanah reveals that he is quite the man and doesn't really understand his wife. There's this idea in ancient times, and this is something that actually is codified in the Hammurabi Code, that there were different kinds of wives. Okay, so you had a wife for companionship, partnership, and then you would have a wife to produce your babies. Okay, and of course, this is a model that is not really taken up in the Bible. If anything, when Sarah suggests bringing Hagar, we see at the end, Hagar, that it doesn't solve her problem. because she's not content with being the partner and let Hagar have the children. She still wants to have children as well, even though clearly she is the partner of Abraham. And so here we have a situation almost as if Elkanah is saying, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, Hannah. I don't have to have children. You have me. You're my partner. I'm devoted for you. I'm giving you the special portions. You and I are the ones that talk. You and I are the ones that have the most important relationship. That should be more important to you or better than 10 children. What does it matter? And I think that, of course, he doesn't get it. Women, certainly women that I know, I would say most women, although today in modern times, you have women who are choosing not to have children, which is very, very difficult for me to understand. But I would say traditionally, women need to have children. And women who don't have children, for the most part, feel terrible about it. Now, there's always going to be exceptions, okay? But what we see in these biblical women, the fact that Elkanah gives her such a wonderful relationship, they indeed have a wonderful relationship that cannot come at the expense of her desire for children. Her desire for children is so deep-seated that it's not something, Elkanah, as wonderful as he may be to her, it's not something he can ever compensate for. So that's what we've gotten today. Didn't get very far, but we did make a start. Now, feel free to open up your mics, everybody. And if you want to make any comments, feel free.
Toda Rabah, Sondra, Toda Rabah.
Oh, thank you.
From Florida.
Thank you.
Toda Rabah.
Thank you.
Yesli Rock East.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to hear from you.
Sondra, was it typical or, not uncommon for a child to be raised by the priest?
I'm sure it was very unusual. Now, in pagan societies, I think it was quite common. You know, it's like these, I don't know, it's kind of similar to what became monks or something like that, although monks were usually not boys, they were adults. But I think you had this idea in pagan societies and in modern times even, where a son was, given to the temple to serve. But it's certainly not something that we see in the Bible anywhere else. I think it was coming from Hannah's deep desire to have children that she made this oath to demonstrate her, she wanted to this child that she would be willing to give this child back to God if he just allowed her to have the child and have him for the first few years. And I think, by the way, we can assume that he wasn't divorced from his parents. I'm sure they saw him, they went up, they visited, he saw them, but he was permanently in the tabernacle, in the temple there.
I bet she didn't wean him very young.
Well, I think in those years it was probably common to breastfeed until about 3 years old at least.
But I expect she a little later.
Maybe till 5.
Yes. Come on.
Right.
Would you have given yours up at 3? No.
I was certainly wouldn't have.
No. And I'm told that in the deep South in the United States that some of them used to nurse off and on till they're 6 or 7. So
could be. Absolutely. Could be.
And they'd eat other things, but they still, yeah.
Right.
And I expect Moses' mother kept him a little while too,
Very well. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's interesting with Moses, he clearly must have had something to do with his family.
Yeah, I think so.
Because he knew his brother. Later on when he's an adult and God says to him, go towards Egypt, your brother Aaron is coming. He knew he was. He didn't say, who's that? So it wasn't like the daughter of Pharaoh took him away from his family. She raised him, but there must have been some kind of connection. And it's probably the same with here. He was in the temple and he was devoted to that, but he must have still had a connection with his family, I would assume.
In chapter 2, verse 18, it says she made him a little linen apod and took it up every year.
Right. Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, absolutely.
And
so she was still there. Yes.
going back to Pharaoh's daughter, I've heard teaching on it that said, why was she, when she lived in a palace, going down to this crocodile river to bathe? And it said that it was because the Nile was a fertile river, that she was probably barren and wanted children. And there was probably some superstition that if you went and bathed in this water or something, you would get a child. And that's probably why she was going down to the river. But who knows? So it's not.
That makes a lot of sense. In fact, it sounds familiar what you're saying. I think at some point in my many years ago heard a similar commentary, but I think it makes a lot of sense. Wonderful. Thank you, Lynn. Okay, anybody else have anything they want to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you commented, because one of the things that always puzzled me, why some people in the Bible had multiple wives, but you sort of alluded it to a little bit just now. Do you want to comment a bit further?
Well, look, I see, for example, if you go back to Deuteronomy, here, I'll find you the exact place. In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 15, if a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the unloved one, when he wills his property to his sons, he may not treat his firstborn, the son of the loved one, in disregard of the son of the unloved one who is older. Instead, he must accept the firstborn, the son of the unloved one, and allot to him a double portion of all he possesses, since he is the first fruit of his vigor, the birthright is his due. Right here, you have a legal situation. You have, it's like a dry law, you know, if your firstborn is born from the wife you love least, he's still your firstborn and receives all the legal rights of a firstborn. But by bringing this in the way it does, two wives, one is loved and one is unloved or even hated. Actually, my translation says unloved, but the Hebrew says snua, which really means hated. It's really such a very strong word. I think in a way, also here, scripture is telling us it's okay, but do you really want to get involved with this? Two wives, and one you love and one you hate, and you have children and there's disputes between children. Now, the very next verse, verse 18, talks about a wayward and defiant son, a son who ends up being absolutely no good, and he's, terribly punished and whatever. And there's commentaries that say it's not by coincidence that this verse about this problematic son follows just on the heels of the two wives, one who's hated and one is loved. That if you have such a dysfunctional family with two sons, two wives, and different sons, and all the rivalry that takes place, there's no question you have a very high chance that one of your sons is going to be a mess coming out of this kind of family. So I think that's just one of a number of places. I mean, don't forget, in the ancient world, it was very, very common to have multiple wives. And we see that in a few things in the Bible where God doesn't come out and say something is wrong, but there's a lot of hints here that say, yeah, do you really want to go there? I'm not going to forbid it, but do you really want to go there? And actually, in Jewish law, about 1,000 years ago, there was a very great rabbi who put out an edict. He said, that's it. No more multiple wives. And that just became the rule. It began in Europe, and it was much later that it was actually adopted in Jewish communities in North Africa and in Asia. But this was something that actually became Jewish law when I guess also as we come into modern times, also, in Western countries, it also became unacceptable to have multiple wives. But I think scripture finds all sorts of ways to give us suggestions, even without forbidding something.
Oh, Sondra, thank you for your comments on that.
Great.
It's been a puzzle to me for years.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, anyway, so yes, someone has a question? Len? Yeah?
I know, I was going to say, we see that with David, King David, and all the troubles and the rivalry between his children. Really? And then Solomon goes on and has all his children.
Okay, well, Solomon is a different kind of situation. Okay, David, yes, there's some real problems. He doesn't have tons of wives. He's got, kind of, for a king, for sure, a moderate number of wives. But even so, he certainly gets into trouble in a way, circumstances, beyond his control, because his original wife is Michal, and that is, Saul's daughter, and so they're forced to separate, and then Saul gives her to somebody else, and then he ends it up with, Abigail and, a few others along the way. And then Michal comes back, and she doesn't want to come back. And so he's got real drama, in David. But with Solomon has all these wives that are actually diplomatic arrangements. And we learn in the Bible in Deuteronomy, when we have the rules of the king, that one of the things a king of Israel is admonished, do not have too many wives. Now, it doesn't say don't have more than one, but it says don't have too many wives. And if I can find the source for that, I will in a minute. But then you have Solomon. And really, at the end of the day, the scripture is extremely specific that he had all these wives, and they swayed him to pagan worship and away from worshiping of God. And so scripture is very specific that in having all these wives, Solomon really did sin. But with Solomon, I don't think it's so much that he was eager to have all these wives because he loved so many women. I mean, 1,000 wives. But in his case, it was much more, I would say, the attraction of being a king like everybody else, building up power, building up diplomatic relations. And the way of things were done in the ancient world is the more powerful a king you were, the more diplomatic relations you had with countries around you. And the way to cement that was to marry the wife of every king and prince in your area. And that's basically what he did. I did find the source in Deuteronomy 17. It says here, verse 15, shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. And then he goes on, it says, moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. And he shall not have, this is verse 17, he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray. And of course, the classic example of that was Solomon, who had many wives as a king, okay, for king reasons, okay, but it certainly led him astray.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Sondra.
You're welcome. Okay, anyway, have a great week, and I will see you again next week as we continue with chapter 1 in the book of Samuel.
I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at CFOIC.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.